Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about housing. We have Andrea Rodgers from Maui on the line with us, and I'm really excited to be talking to another mom who has a son with autism, who is a few years ahead of, action-wise, ahead of us parents who are thinking about residential and exploring housing because she's already done it. And I want to pick her brain and ask her a few questions today. So, Andrea, tell us when you were first thinking that you could handle starting some housing.
So my story goes back to when my son was 15 and he was going through puberty, and he, really wasn't potty trained yet. And he's 33 today. So we go back quite a few years of realizing, first of all, I know I'm not immortal. And what really is his future, and what is the quality of his life going to look like? First of all, eventually finishing high school and then moving into adult years. And, the fear of all of us parents is what's going to happen when I'm no longer capable of taking care of him. And not to mention, is that the quality of life he wants? I don't know if we think back to being 21, did we want to live with our parents anymore? I mean, there's a natural flow of wanting to live independently. So that was really where my journey began, and it takes us back to about 2000.
That's pretty exciting. So you were thinking about, just like I am, and a lot of us moms are thinking, what are we going to do? But we basically put our head in the sand and go, I don't know. Let me think about that later. But what were the first steps that you take? Did you start with researching what was legal in Hawaii? Because isn't it true that every state has different rules?
Yeah, it appears they do. I really only know Hawaii because that's where all of my work has been done, in Hawaii. So yeah, the first step, of course, was researching the Department of Health website. Obviously for extremely wealthy people, they might go about it a different way, but for those of us that are in the Medicaid waiver program, and that's providing most of the support through the Department of Health, the first step is, well, what does Medicaid offer and what do they recommend through the DD office at the Department of Health on the state level? And when you go there, you're going to find there's different sorts of license settings. I wish they would come up with a new word, but there's the adult foster care home. And of course, all of us, I always have to tell parents, it's not adult foster care. It's not like what you think of as the 7-year-old kid whose mother's a drug addict and the kid's going to foster care. It's just a title that licenses a home for 2 special needs people. And there's funding for the state through that. And it's one of the easier licenses to get. And then, of course, there's more complex licenses for group homes, DD, DOM, ARCH, different license settings. And that's, in the Department of Health realm. But if we take even a step back before all of that, so my journey involved this wanting to get a licensed group homes up and running for my son. And going back 10, 15 years ago, we were in a very different world. I mean, as I was mentioning earlier, we still called DD MR meaning mental retardation. That was in the state statutes, in the last 15 years. And today we would never say that. We say IDD, intellectual developmental disabilities. With the word MR has been completely taken out of our dialogue completely. Mm-hmm. So, we've seen a huge shift in the last 10, 15 years of what dignity actually looks like, for our children. So, but going back earlier, my first step was, of course, working through a nonprofit. I got to know my state senators, my state representatives, and I found out about a thing called Capital Improvement Grants, GIA, Grant and Aid. So we went ahead and kind of pitched our idea for this group home to it was the Senate Ways and Means Committee and the House Finance Committee. We wrote this, 100-page application, and lo and behold, many, many years later, we were gifted with a $400,000 check, which we then used to buy this home.
So let me interrupt you. So that kind of is that a grant or a loan? But when you say capital, you mean property or building. It's not for a program, it's for actual physical items, right?
Yeah, so the state grant and aid is a funding source for organizations. And there's two components. One would be operations and one would be capital improvements. Capital improvements would be for buying a house, for example. It's for things. So that was where we initially got the funding to purchase the first house that I was a part of licensing. And that came through just knocking on the door. I don't know since COVID if you can still knock on their doors, but walking around and talking to the senators and representatives firsthand and telling them why we were doing what we were doing, understanding the statistics. Now in Maui at the time, there were 3 licensed group homes that I believe maybe 4 that housed, 12 to 15 people. And you're talking about thousands of people or hundreds at least that need housing that are eventually going to get, older. So the sell, so to speak, wasn't that difficult, but it was just a matter of being persistent. First of all, writing the grant even, and not cowering away from writing the grant. And I've since helped many other people write these grants. You just got to keep answering every question. Just answer every question.
So when you say you went around to certain state senators, were they the ones on a certain committee that could look at your grant and aid, or did you just go to the ones that represent you? Was there a strategy?
Yeah, great question. So the determining people at the time, and I'm assuming it's the same people today, Cynthia, are the Senate Ways and Means Committee, okay, and the House Finance Committee. So I got the names of all the Senate Ways and Means people. I got the name of the representatives on the House Finance Committee, and then I got the names of all of my representatives in Maui County. And that was my list. And I went door to door, and there was probably, I want to say, 35 offices I visited. I did my best to schedule appointments where I could. If I couldn't schedule appointments, I brought collateral materials and met with their chief of staff or whoever would talk to me. And basically, there was a window of opportunity to kind of convince them that this should be one of the things they should put in the state budget.
So how it works is they probably are looking at hundreds of applications, and you wanted to get in their face and let them know what the reason is, and physically, and do some lobbying for your project. So when they started to vote, they remembered who you were and what the needs were. That's really smart.
Thank you. And, one of the things I did was I also spent a lot of time researching each of the senators and representatives, looking for any link to the disability community. At the time, this goes back more than 10 years ago, but at the time, one of the, I think, chairman of the House Finance Committee had a cousin that lived at Halimanu Plantation. So I knew right away I had to have a personal meeting with that person. I couldn't just go to the chief of staff or their administrative assistants. I had to meet with that representative specifically. So if there was any obvious link to the disability community, I really, wanted to focus on those people as well.
So I have a question for you right now. So at that point, when you were just trying to get the grant and aid, were you thinking of a foster home, the easier one with the 2 people, or were you thinking of something more elaborate like the actual group home?
We were looking for the group home. Now, if we fast forward, we eventually did get one of our grants released. It's kind of one of those comical stories is we got in the state. I always tell people, just because you get in the state budget, don't think the check's showing up. You're only 50% there. So you're in the state budget and you've still got to get the governor to release the money. And literally, when you're in the state budget, in my opinion, you're only 50% there. So we had one grant and aid for $480,000 that expired because we never got Governor Lingle to release the funding, no matter what we did. And then the second one, Governor Abercrombie had come into office, and it was literally going to expire that June. He took office in January, and we were successful getting that one released. And that one was the $400,000 that we actually used to purchase the first group home.
That's really scary to think that you could go so far as to actually get a yes on your grant and aid, and then the governor lets it expire. That's good to know in advance that you're only halfway there.
Yeah, you're only halfway there. So I don't know. And once again, this dates back to 2010, so the system may be different today. But we did, of course, get the money, and we found a house, and we purchased the house. Then we did independent grant writing because the house needed a lot of work. So it was grants again through the nonprofit that funded renovating the house. Now, I had a commitment to myself that my son, and of course, I was doing all of this as a volunteer mom at the time. I was not working for the organization. I was committed that my son was going to live independently before his 25th birthday. And someone had once told me that once kids get to be over 25, the dependency between mom and child starts getting so thick that it's harder and harder for the independent living. So I, for whatever reason, decided that that was my goal. It was to get him into a house by his 25th birthday. So then, we have the house, we've renovated the house, and we're ready to move in. And we actually did the foster process first, only because it was easier. And so we got the foster license, and then continued with the DOM license, which was for 5 residents.
Okay, so you did it in phases. So the foster was like phase 1. And then was that a question of more paperwork and more licensing to actually get the house approved? And so the foster was a little quicker?
It was quicker. Now, I don't think that that could be done today, because now they will not allow an agency run foster care home. So a foster care home in the state of Hawaii has to be literally your next door neighbor who has no affiliation with any sort of agency whatsoever decides to open a foster care home. So that step is a bit superfluous in today's world, because I don't believe you could do that anymore. If you are an agency or a nonprofit or a business of any, you can only open a DOM home, an arch home, another one, if the foster care has to be mom and pop next door, decide, okay, we're gonna have some foster kids, or in this case, special needs adults living in our home. So, so we then moved on to the DOM licensing process, which actually was literally a 100-page application, and it took, I want to say, 2 years.
Can you explain to our other moms that'll be listening, what is the difference? Why did you choose a DOM home and not an arch level 1 home? Because don't they both work for 5 people, and what would the difference be?
I actually don't even know. When speaking to them, they said the arch would work longer as they moved into their senior years. But I wish I could answer more clearly. We were going DOM home, and there was never an understanding that there was anything other than a DOM home. Okay. So I'm going to yield that question to somebody who's compared the two, because I don't feel qualified to answer. So we started the DOM home process, and through just ongoing tenacity, first step, of course, is you have to get the home signed off by all of your county people, your plumbing, your sanitation, your electric. And, that was a funny journey, because, this was the first newly licensed home in Maui County since 1985. So I was working with county officials that were not born the last time a house was licensed, or were children. And so my first journey involved them saying, we need a manhole. They wanted to permit it with a certificate of occupancy that was the same as if you were building a church or a school or a restaurant. And, and I'm working, trying to get them to sign these documents saying the house is up to code, the electricity's right. And then finally, I had to research the state statutes. And in the state statutes, it actually says a licensed home is the same as a single family residence. Okay, I'm going to say that again. In the state statutes, state of Hawaii statutes, it says a licensed care home is the same as a single family residence. So what I had to do was take the state statute back to the county officials and educate them on a licensed care home, and the state would supersede the county laws. And then the second I was able to do that, they signed off on everything.
Wow. So you were like forging the way the whole time, because they didn't know as many rules as you knew, actually, the people you were dealing with. So yeah, but that's what it took to dot the I's and cross the T's.
Yes. So,
So how
so
long did that whole approval process take you?
it took about 2 years.
Wow.
And it really, I used to laugh because, with all the best intentions, I felt like sometimes you'd send a 100-page document to the county or to the state Office of Healthcare Assurance. They'd take 6 weeks to send you back a letter that said page 18, you use the word caregiver with 2 words, and page 22, it was 1 word, you have to be consistent. And of course, I'm being facetious, but that's what I felt like was happening at the time, because we were ready to go. We had people who wanted to move in, and, it just seemed to drag on and drag on. But, now looking back, okay, 2 years, we got there, we did it. And, we ended up licensing the first newly licensed home in Maui County since 1985, and that was in 2015.
That's amazing. So do you have plans to expand that?
Well, so here's the interesting thing. So the funding the house is always been a challenge, and that's why there aren't more group homes. So, we really had to think outside of the box in the way to create the quality, because as far as Chapter 89, now Chapter 89 is a Hawaii revised statute that dictates how a house is licensed, or at least a DD-DOM house is licensed. And Chapter 89 outlines, how big the closets have to be, just every little detail about the home. So anyone who's thinking of opening a home should read, if they're looking at DD-DOM, should read Chapter 89, because it tells you everything that you would ever want to know about running the home and what the home could look like, and so on and so forth. And for them, 1 adult taking care of 5 residents, up to 5 residents, is all that's required. So, and that, there has to be 24-hour care if there's residents in the home, and that's kind of the name of the DD-DOM. And the funding source for the DD-DOM literally is SSI with a state supplement. So you're looking in the neighborhood of, if you have 5 residents, about $6,000 a year to run the home. So, even if you have no mortgage, when you look at food, you look at travel, maybe you want to own a car, the staff that's living in the home, it doesn't take a long time till you figure out the math doesn't add up. And so, I think that's one of the reasons there has not been more licensed care homes, over the past 20, 30 years in Hawaii. Now, with the onset of the HCBS final rule and Medicaid waiver,
well, let me just back up for 1 second. There are a lot of homes for seniors that we live in Oahu. Do the numbers work better for the senior care and not so well for us, or how does that work?
I don't know. I once again can't speak to the senior care homes if they're funded differently than the DOM homes or not. I don't know. I just know in the DOM home, as far as Chapter 89 and the funding source, it is literally the SSI and the state supplement, which totals it for 5 residents in the neighborhood of $6,000 a month to run the home. So we were very fortunate, however, in the state that with the onset of the HCBS final rule coming down on the federal level, it was started in 2014. It's still being implemented as I speak today, but in 2016, the Medicaid waiver standards were rewritten, and those standards, I believe, started in 2017 or 2018, and they introduced something called RES-HAB, residential habilitation funding, which immensely shifted the financial feasibility of running a licensed care home. The RES-HAB funding now came through the Medicaid waiver program, and it attaches to each person, each resident living in the home, based on their skill level, a dollar sign. It's basically anywhere from $89 a night per resident to $189. I'm not really quite sure, depending on the level of care, the level of need. Now, one thing to note about DD-DOM homes is that everybody living there except one person has to be what's called self-preserving. And so every year on your medical form, you have to have a doctor sign self-preserving. What self-preserving means in layman's terms is, my son will leave a burning building on a verbal command. And I laugh because he's autistic, so we only hope he would leave a burning building on a verbal command, meaning, you're standing out in the road going, go to the door, go to the door. You can only hope he would go to the door, but, nevertheless, the doctor will sign, yes, we consider him self-preserving. Now, you can have up to one non-self-preserving person in a DOM home, but that person would need an extra person with them 24 hours a day, meaning if you have 1 in 5 required by Chapter 89, as soon as you put in a non-self-preserving person, they would have to always have 2 staff in residence at all time, 1 specific to get the person out of the burning building, say they were deaf, for example, and couldn't follow directions, or I don't know, just lower functioning, I guess. So right away that would, financially put a very big burden on the home. So, anyone who has a non-self-preserving child is going to be really challenged with finding the right living environment for them.
And
Yes.
you can pick 4 of the ones that can self-preserve themselves. So it's even more difficult for the families of these more low, able to not self-preserve.
Exactly. Not to mention financially, it's going to be having to provide a second staff member 24 hours a day without a whole lot of budget increase makes it not very attractive for the operators of these group homes to even consider a non-self-preserving child, because it's going to cost them more to staff a house with a non-self-preserving child. Now, that being said, ResHab funding through Medicaid waiver has done an immensely wonderful job of mitigating a little bit of this, because they've added a lot more funding into those homes. And it's been, I want to say, 3 years now since ResHab funding started. So if you take a very simple math formula, if you have 5 self-preserving adults that are, pretty high functioning, you're looking at going from operating a home at about $6,000 a month to about $16,000 a month by having the ResHab funding. And so the ResHab funding, last I checked, the only requirement of ResHab funding is that the child slept in the home. So unlike those of us that have, PAB services or CLS services or other services through Medicaid waiver, there's data collection, there's, a lot more, they were with them from 8 in the morning till 10 in the morning, whatever there's not really that kind of oversight. They still do have to write quarterly reports, and there still are goals attached to ResHab funding, but that kind of somebody was with them, from noon to 4 is through ResHab there's no requirement for that. There's just, they slept in the home. And then every night the resident sleeps in the home, they get this payment up to, I believe it's 340 days a year based on their level of need. And for most high self-preserving people, it's about $100 a day.
For you to have to pay the staff.
Yes. Well, ResHab is, I think the interesting thing, and this is where the logistics kind of goes on the side. And for me, there's this immense philosophical commitment to quality and dignity for my son and for your daughter. And what I feel like the trend in Medicaid waiver in the last 5 years is the federal government, in my opinion, is justifying all these dollars to give my son the ability to live his life as similar as possible to somebody his same age with his same interests without a disability.
Okay.
So I'm going to say that again. In my opinion, the entire trend of Medicaid waiver with the HCBS final rule, how the federal government is justifying spending this money on our children, is they are attempting to create a program that gives my son the ability to live his life as similar as possible to somebody of a similar age with similar interests without a disability. And that, to me, is a huge quantitative leap to a group home, to an institutional setting, to managing their care, so to speak, is, what does it look like for your daughter to live her life? I don't remember, how old is your daughter?
She's 27.
27. Okay. So if you look at what you were interested in doing when you were 27. Maybe you were traveling, maybe you had your first job, maybe you were finishing college. What would it look like if your daughter had a life that was exactly the same as another 27-year-old girl with similar interests that didn't have a disability? And what would be what she would require to have that? And I just, it's such a simple concept, but in what I'm observing is it's a quantum leap in everything that's been done up until this point. So,
well, if that funding, that extra ResHab funding only started 3 years ago, I'm not an expert on budgets, but I understand that funding comes and goes. I mean, that's the best of the best. Do you think that that's going to stay? We have no way of knowing that, but that seems to be what's allowing you to operate successfully.
Well, what they did is they made cuts on the day program side of things to kind of compensate for the for supplementing with the ResHab funding. But overall, the ResHab created a functionally financial viable option for people to build residential care homes, because up until then, nobody wanted to build them, because how would you operate them on $6,000 a month? It just wasn't feasible. You could spend $2,000 alone on food and utilities, another $1,000, and it doesn't take long to figure out there's not enough money. So the ResHab was an attempt to strengthen I suppose the inspiration for people to even consider building group homes.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting, because I do know that that the day programs did get their lunch taken away and things like this. So, gosh, I didn't know it, comes from one side to give to the other, but at least now, hopefully people this is a good cycle to start putting in the plans and the aid application, the capital aid applications, because now this money does make it feasible for the DOM group homes.
Well, certainly when you go to say an organization wants to go to the government to get funding, or any of the big funders, Weinberg, whoever, they're going to want to know, okay, if we help you build this house, how are you going to operate it? What's your long-term plan? How does this work? And one of the things that anyone trying to get a grant has to be able to articulate clearly is, what's the business plan to keep this functioning and keep this open and long term. And so certainly having the ResHab funding written into the Medicaid waiver standards at least makes, for people wanting to do a licensed group home, it makes a viable plan for operating the home.
I have a question for you. I spoke to a disability housing person in Connecticut, and they have a program in Connecticut where they try and get all the parents to get their, when they turn 18, their children on the Section 8 waiting lists, and this helps the group homes later on when they're finally ready to go in. Then some people, at least in the Connecticut, they take one room in the household and make that Section 8, which brings them a little extra income. And they said that is a difference between making their budget and not making their budget. So I'm wondering if that is something that I should look into, because I know there's no Section 8 gets closed and open and closed and open, but that seems like it does pay the operator or the homeowner a little bit more than the SSI would.
So I tell every parent, is the day they open that waiting list, get your son, daughter on that list, because it can take up to 5 years to qualify. Now, my son has already been on the list, got approved a Section 8 housing voucher. Now in Hawaii, that housing voucher cannot be used in a licensed setting. So I'm not sure how Connecticut's doing it differently, but they're kind of, Cynthia, two different trajectories. So there's the licensed setting, and then there's independent living with a Section 8 housing voucher. And I would like to talk quite a bit more about that as well. Maybe we could kind of complete the housing licensed housing model and then move into kind of more independent living, because I've explored both of them pretty thoroughly at this point. So going back to licensed setting, like I said, my son was living in this group home. You know, we had a lot of, one of the things that worth exploring, and I know that other groups are using a similar program. I was very committed to this concept of life sharing. I didn't want to see this one staff member taking care of 5 people with shifts coming and going, wearing scrubs, because that to me is the absence of dignity. It's not, you know, I wanted it to feel more like like the first home you lived after college where you had roommates. So what we did in the early days of my son's group home is we had the staff who lived there, we called them the house parent. And then we would find interns that would come through these programs like, you know, Workaway or AmeriCorps. There's heaps of volunteer programs out there all over the internet. And we would find people in their young 20s that would commit to coming for 6 months. And basically they would live in the group home, free room, free board, in exchange for 20 hours of care. And it was really an incredible model, because at the heyday of my son's group home, you know, we had 5 residents and 4 people living in the home. So there was almost a 50-50 split, or as close to it as we could, of young people that wanted to go out and play ball in the field with my son, and, you know, take them down to the, you know, Saturday market, or, you know, whatever. And there was, you know, if you have 4, and then at any given point there's 2 or 3, and then people would even be in the home when they weren't, quote, on shift, because they wanted to have dinner with the group. So we'd have these, you know, big 8-9 person dinners. It was really fun, and it financially worked, because every person, if you have enough rooms in the house, every person that's exchanging 20 hours for free room and board is saving the agency about $20,000 a year of providing a staff. And as a result, putting more people, so our children feel more like they're life sharing instead of living in a traditional group home where the staff comes and goes, and, you know, is very much you know, the idea being, you know, if you go to your job, you go home on the weekends and you plant a flower garden. If you live at the group home, you plant the flower garden at the group home. So I hope that distinction seems, you know, so we were going for, we want people that are building the flower garden at the group home, not going home to their real life to build their flower garden. So that model, and it's completely legal as long as you've never given them $1. Now, to be clear, if you have these interns and there may be, I can't give direct Department of Labor information, but my understanding was the day you give them $1, you have to pay them for every hour they're there, at least minimum wage. So you really have 2 options. You either have these people that come in the home for, and I would always ask for a 6-month commitment. And they would be, you know, young kids right out of college who wanted some experience. Maybe they were going to go back to grad school to be a physical therapist, or, you know, whatever. And never paid them. They just exchanged 20 hours a week for living there for free and preparing food. And of course, you know, we'd have to train them and give them criminal background checks and do all the qualifications required for the group home, but we didn't pay them. The day you start paying them, now you have to really examine that, because now every hour they're there, they have to get at least minimum wage. So that's a whole nother exploration. So that worked really well for a while. And then I don't know if it was just COVID setting in, or I don't really know what happened, but at some point the group home, going back to this ResHab, so the only requirement with the ResHab as far as the Department of Health is concerned is that the person slept in the home. Even though there are guidelines that say, you know, we expect at CIS level 1, they should have 4 hours of one-on-one time above and beyond, or 20 hours above and beyond. There's no requirement. So even at my son's level, he was supposed to get about 20 hours of one-on-one time with the ResHab person, because the Department of Health at the time didn't require it. It was kind of like an honor system. And so what I noticed, and I don't know if it was because the group home was struggling financially because of COVID or what, overnight, the quality went from all these people around my son doing all these great things to one staff member taking care of 5 residents. And in my opinion, the ResHab funding was going to pay management salaries, and there was really no oversight or nothing I could do to shift that. And so it became this very frustrating, where what I want to say is what is considered compliancy on the level of the licensing committee is not necessarily the quality that we as parents want for our children. So I really, throughout this whole last year, have done a lot of soul searching, knowing that HCBS final rule is coming into play. It was supposed to start last March as a mandated part of our Medicaid waiver program in the state of Hawaii. I believe that this March, you have to adhere to those, that community integration concept. So my son actually left his group home last summer, and we kind of looked at what does quality really look like? And I'm not saying that a group home can't be quality. Having been through it as a parent, I just caution people. A management change, a staff change, and overnight you've gone from life sharing to a managed care home with one person taking care of 5 people, and and the quality just wasn't what I wanted for my son anymore.
Okay, and let me backtrack. Final rule is a big federal change. And my understanding is that, let's say you had a dream of having a piece of property and having a place where people could learn skills during the day, and then maybe there's another place where they could live at night. That has stopped. They don't want the residential and any day program or learning program on the same piece of property. So that's what we're doing with final rule. So if you had a dream of residential with all these other things, you probably have to make 2 different programs in 2 different places.
Right. And there's many pieces of the final rule is one piece. HUD has put out in their documents that you can no longer have, if you say you bought an apartment building and you were going to have all these special needs people living in the apartment building, well, you can no longer have more than 25% of the apartments earmarked for special needs people. So if you have 12 apartments in a building, you now have to have 8 apartments that are for veterans, typically abled people, whatever. You can only have 4 of those be for special needs people. Not to mention there's a movement to, I believe it's to amend the ADA Act. I don't know how far it's gotten on the federal level, but it actually says that the agency that manages the group home cannot be the same agency that does the day program. Okay, and having been through this, I get that, because what happens is that the fear of homelessness is so great that I think maybe not in Hawaii, but in other places in the country, somebody will allow abuse and neglect behind closed doors because they don't want to be homeless, because being homeless is way scarier than eating terrible food or being left alone for hours on end. And so I get it now why they're trying to separate all of this and really get people more into the community, going back to, fund an opportunity for our children to live their life in as normal as possible way, like somebody their age with their similar interests without a disability. And that is not, necessarily in this, behind closed doors in a community, because what I learned is that you can have this wonderful community, and then once again management changes or staff changes, and then suddenly the quality that you thought was there is gone overnight, and that it hits you blindsided as a parent, because what is compliancy on the state level is not always the quality that you and I are looking for. So once again, I just caution people going the group home rate direction to just be aware that could happen, and, really just be aware. And I think there's lots of opportunity to work on the license direction and create great programs. And maybe some of this HCBS final rule will help that. But I now have gone a different direction, going back into the Section 8 housing discussion, where
let me just formally end this, and we'll do a different section here in case we wanted to chop it up later.
Okay,
But
sure.
So thank you very much for explaining the housing, the DOM housing, and your amazing warrior mom project of putting that housing together, which took years, and figuring out the finances. And now we're going to start a discussion on independent living for adults with special needs. And I understand you've done a lot of research on independent living, so I can't wait to hear your ideas.
Okay, great. So looking at independent living, and I actually think this concept, Cynthia, of independent living is more in keeping with the trends in our society and the direction post HCBS final rule on community integration, because there's just too much of a temptation in a licensed setting to have, and I use the word lightly, neglect, because I wouldn't say neglect like we would think of this horror story, but just generally as parents, what we want for our children, not kind of sitting in front of a television for hours on end, though, you know, those kinds of neglect that aren't terrible, but I do see that this licensed setting, if it's not managed by the right people, could lend itself to that. So this, now we move into like the concept of independent living, and you had asked earlier about the Section 8 housing voucher. And once again, I encourage every parent with a child with disabilities to apply for the Section 8 housing voucher, because like I said, my son's he sat on a waiting list for 5 years. Now remember, he's 33. His name came up. I did not take the voucher because he was in a group home setting that I was very happy with at the time. So now he's back on the list again, and it may take another 5 years. But what the Section 8 housing voucher does is it gives essentially free rent to someone like your daughter or my son. Maybe depending on their income, if they work or something, maybe they have to put $100 towards the rent. But we have a gentleman right now working with us, and he has a 2-bedroom. Because he's a Down syndrome guy, he has a 2-bedroom, so he is allowed to live with a companion, because living independently is not the best thing for him. So he qualifies for, I believe it's $1,800 a month towards his rent, and the Section 8 housing voucher pays that rent. It's I think it's $1,600 and up to $200 for utilities, but I don't know the exact numbers, but in the neighborhood of $1,800 for a 2-bedroom. And he just has to fill out a form that, his doctor signs that says he needs a companion, and then he qualifies for a 2-bedroom. So
and what are the rules for the companion? It has to be a non-paid person or a paid person? Are there any particular rules?
There actually are no rules at all. So the person living with him could just be a family member or a neighbor or anyone, or it could actually be his paid caregiver. That's because, remember, Section 8 is a federal program. Medicaid waiver is being done by the state. So say hypothetically the person living with him could also be his Medicaid waiver worker, but they would be being paid by the Department of Health, not by Section 8. So they're totally two separate entities. And so it really just depends on the dynamic of the family with the Section 8 housing voucher. So the first step is finding an apartment in the house, an ohana, that is, would rent to him with the Section 8.
And let me interrupt you there, because I've had a lot of parents ask me, let's say they're a cousin and they have a nephew, or they have a cousin that's like Ian, your son, and wants to do independent living. Could someone who has a little piece of their house, a rental unit with a separate entrance, could they apply to have that become a Section 8? So you sort of have a neighbor or somebody who is the landlord.
So I try to help families realize that, once again, as long as it's got its own entrance, it's got a bathroom, whatever the HUD list is of what they're going to check for, they're not checking if your house is allowed to have an ohana. They're only checking the federal requirements. Are the screens ripped? Is the plumbing going in the right place? Those types of things.
So have you ever heard of this? Just popped into my head. Have you ever heard of some parents who are getting older, and they may have an adult son or daughter, can they reconfigure their own house to meet the HUD list? And let's say there's a different entrance on the other side of the driveway where their independent adult could be going to work and coming back, and they may not even see them every day. Could it possibly be that kind of situation where the parents can get Section 8 approval on their own property?
Well, my understanding, and I'm not an authority, but my understanding, Cynthia, is the only caveat is that if you are the guardian, you can't own the property. So, for example, if I own my own house, I cannot use my ohana for my son's HUD.
Okay.
So I don't quite know how that works because I haven't had to do it directly, but I have been told that the only caveat would be that I cannot use my own property, and because I do have an ohana on my property, that my son cannot use Section 8.
Okay, that's good. That's good that you clarified that, because I think parents need to learn as many options as possible. I got really excited about something that Idaho was doing, but it's very slow to change what Hawaii is doing. So my goal is to educate the families with what works and what the rules are right now, to see what options they have. But if they're the guardian and they can't do it on their own property, well, maybe they have a sister-in-law or a cousin in the neighborhood where they could do it at their house. And how hard is it? You might not know this, but how hard is it to get your unit approved as a HUD Section 8? Is that a difficult process?
I have 2 rentals right now that are Section 8. One is not rented to a special needs person. It's just a mom and a son. And so I've been through the HUD inspection, and then the other one is with a special needs person. So I've done a number of HUD inspections, and surprisingly enough, people should not be scared of it at all. They come to your house, they may find something, okay, that light switch, it's backwards or something like that. I don't know a lot about electricity, but we had one issue where we had to, and the guy said, well, you either have to fix the plug or you have to just put a cover over it and not use it, but it can't be visible because it's inverted or not grounded or something, I forget. So they come around, okay, you've got a rip in your screen, you can't have your porch 10 gauge wire can't be exposed to your porch light. Those are the sorts of things that they're fussing with.
Okay.
Your overhead light's not working. You don't have to have a bathroom ceiling fan or an exhaust system, but if you have one visible, it has to work. So we had another situation with an inspection with another friend's house where we had to look at, well, do we fix the exhaust in the bathroom or do we just take it out and cover it up? Because you don't have to have one, but if it's there, it has to work. So it's actually not a huge deal. They come over, they have their checklist, and then they tell you have 30 days to fix, and they're very clear. They tell you exactly what to fix. And most people are so nervous because they're worried that like the building inspector's coming or something like that. And it's totally different than that. People should not be afraid of doing HUD at all. It's a great guaranteed income for the owner. People with disabilities take really good care of their apartments. They pay fair rent. I mean, I don't know for you guys if a 2-bedroom ohana $1,800 is a good rent, but in Maui, you can find places. I mean, not the fanciest places, but you can find places. There's no person coming over saying, this is zoning inappropriate or anything like that. It's a completely different office. So it's actually, nobody should be afraid of having a HUD inspector come and look at their ohana, because I'll email you the list of what they check for.
Okay. Well, thank you for explaining that. And we have to wrap up pretty soon, but do you want to say one final thing about quality of life and independent living, since this is...
I would love to schedule another interview because I haven't even gotten to what we're currently doing.
Let's do that. Let's do that. Let's do...
So we're moving in a completely other direction of quality, dignity, and a full life. And the full life involves real friendships that don't include people that are your family or paid support people, what that looks like in a residential capacity. So licensed home, we went through that. HUD is definitely, everybody get on the list, but I'd love to explore what's beyond both of those components.
Let's
What-
do that. Let's make an interview all around that. I'm really excited for that. And thank you so much, Andrea, for your time today. And I think this is going to help a lot of parents, learn some of the basics with what you've been through, your experience, and independent living is something we'll look forward to, and we'll talk soon.
Okay, thanks, Cynthia.
Okay. Bye-bye.